absolutely. I think it was an attempt on my part to refuse to be given the status of honorary white male writer. Generally speaking, women's work has been reduced to regional or merely, or people compliment ethnic writers by saying or implying that they are as good as mainstream writers. And whereas I understood the compliment, I thought it would be better for me, at least in the late 60s and early 70s, to establish once and for all that all three of those things play. I'm black, I am a woman, and I'm a writer, and they go together. Well, I didn't quite know what else to do when I graduated because my first love was books. So I thought I would choose a position or a job where I taught them and had to read them and had to explain them to others. And university teaching was the thing I loved the most, and I still do. After all these years and all these other kinds of jobs I've had, I've always taught since I'm 26 years old. Well, you know, I'm not quite sure. I know that I don't remember myself unable to read. I don't remember being a person. I know I read sometime before I went to the first grade, and I am assuming that came from my sister, who was a year and a half older. But I sort of always knew how to do that activity, and I remember very clearly being the only student in the first grade class who could read. But I thought it was because the others weren't interested. I lived in a very loving, chaotic, noisy, full of music and argument and comings and goings house. And in that environment, the only privacy there was in books. So I developed this obsession, I think, with that form of escape. Lorain, Ohio is was, not quite sure what it is now, working class town on Lake Erie. My parents appeared there in the around World War I, shortly after. I'd had mills, shipyards, steel mills, and it was home to immigrants, East Europeans, Mexicans, black people from the South. I'm born in the 30s, so I remember it as a Depression town. And then later, during World War II, as a booming town. But my formative opinion of it was this incredible place with all the best parts of what Ohio had to offer those people who were in the mode of the abolitionists. You know, Oberlin University is just up the road a little bit, which was the first college to have women and blacks attend it. And so it was a melting pot, really and truly, because there were so few schools. One high school, 4 junior high schools. We all lived in and among each other. I never lived on any block in which there were no other white people, although the churches and the social lives were frequently separate. And I thought that's the way most people lived, but I learned later it was certainly not the case. Fascinating place to be from, I have to tell you. Quite a bit. My sister and her family, I have nieces and nephews who still live there. And my mother hasn't been dead that long, and she was there all her life. So I have very strong family connections. Oh, that sounds very, it sounds sort of formulaic in a way. But I guess you're right. For me, it just seems enormously a long, long time from my grandfather being born. He was 5 years old when the Emancipation Proclamation was declared. He was born in 1860, right? And he was crying, he was frightened because he kept hearing the adults say, "It's coming, it's coming. Emancipation Proclamation is coming." He thought it was a monster. So he crawled under the bed and they had to pull him out and explain to him it was a good thing. And I'm very keenly aware of the really life-threatening circumstances under which they lived, the difficulty my parents had as a young couple, and a kind of a miraculous thing, I suppose, in my generation. I just knew I really wanted to go to college. My mother was not interested in my getting married. She didn't think that was necessarily the ultimate goal of a woman's life, or rather she thought it shouldn't come too soon. So she and my father were very supportive, and they told me, listen, we don't have enough for you to get a full college education, but we do have enough for 1 year. And I said, that's all I wanted, just 1 year. And so that's the way I went off, convinced that I could survive financially for 1 year in 1949, 50. And of course I was able to work and do the rest myself. But that's how iffy it was in those days about getting, a college education. Oh, I had temporary jobs while I was in Washington. This is at Howard University, where I was an undergraduate. And actually, my mother got a job. She was so happy that I was here, I guess, in college. So she took a job at night as a woman in the ladies' room, collects the tips. And she made $15 a week, $5 a night. And she sent it to me. Oh, a little bit of lunacy, I think, and some vanity. People, my name is C-H-L-O-E. I love the name. Children couldn't pronounce it. Some adults would refuse to pronounce it. And they called me Chulo or Chloe or other things that were not Chloe. In my family, because my sister and I were so close in age, and we were always together, they called us Lois and Chloe. So I didn't really have a separate syllables for myself. At any rate, to make a long story short, when I got away to Howard, I used the name Toni, which was a short and formed of my saint's name, Anthony. So there I was, Toni Walford. Most every people knew me as Toni Walford. And then subsequently, my ex-husband's name, Morrison. I think I was, but I certainly didn't call myself a writer. I was a teacher. And I was interested in the work of some local people here in Washington. Some were faculty members, some were artists. And they had a group of writers that they formed, and I was invited to attend. And I brought with me some, sort of frail little things that I had worked on as a very young person. And one of them was a little story that I had to write fresh, because they wouldn't let me come over and over again if I didn't bring anything new. So I wrote a story and brought it to that meeting, and used it much later as the heart of the first novel I wrote, The Bluest Eye. Well, I wrote the story for the club. I remember my baby, my oldest son, was hanging on my shoulder, pulling at my earrings while I was writing, and I remember him spitting up on the manuscript some orange juice. And I always tell this story. It must be important because I didn't wipe it up right away. I wrote around it and then wiped it up and stopped. And then went to the meeting, had a good time, heard some serious criticism of it, some delight, and that was it. And then later on, several years later, when I was in another place, not teaching anymore, but working at a publishing house, I began to work it up. And then I sent it around to, I think, 12 or 14 publishers before somebody was interested enough to take it. Holt, Alan Zensler, who was at Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston. It was a phone call. There's so many phone calls about, oh, I wish I could take this book, but I don't think they will. I'll try. That's what I remember. And then suddenly I'm sitting at my desk in Random House, and I got the phone call that said, they said yes. I remember that. I think for me, the striking thing is that the person who wrote The Bluest Eye, that voice, that quality exists in Paradise also. That's very important to me, and odd to have a style immediately, not to have to develop one. I had to learn how to write better, how to seduce a reader faster, how to challenge a reader, how to open up the world, how to manipulate. But what I'm pleased about, and I didn't know it until I wrote the second book, Sula, was that I really and truly do have a recognizable style. If I took one page out of any of those books and read it, I think I would know it was me and not somebody else. And I think that's true of readers who know my work. The style, probably it's ineffable at the moment, but it's a kind of welcoming style. The voice is welcoming and doesn't blink and tells you very difficult things, but in a voice that makes it all right to hear. This is not going to be an easy trip. The journey's going to be bumpy, but I'm going to tell you the truth, and you can hear it because I've already been there, and I'm holding your hand, and you can go with me, and it's going to be all right. That's the voice. That's the comfort level. The stories are funny, sad, odd combinations that reveal the complexity and the profundity and the size of human life. Sometimes we live so small. I mean, in our imaginations, I don't mean wealth and status. We live small, frightened lives. And sometimes the people in the books do, but generally speaking, the most important thing that happens is that their lives are larger and that they learn something at the end of the book that but for the book they never would have learned. Beloved is a story based on a historical figure of a black woman who killed her children, or tried to, when she was a fugitive and didn't want to return to slavery. Beloved is about her life as imagined by me, significantly altered by the return of what she believes to be the daughter she killed. The sheriff turned, then said to the other three, "You better go on. Look like your business is over. Mine's started now." School teacher beat his hat against his thigh and spit before leaving the woodshed. Nephew and the catcher backed out with him. They didn't look at the woman in the pepper plants with the flower in her hat, and they didn't look at the 7 or so faces that had edged closer in spite of the catcher's rifle warning. Enough, the sheriff, enough nigger eyes for now. Little nigger boy eyes open in sawdust. Little nigger girl eyes staring between the wet fingers that held her face so her head wouldn't fall off. Little nigger baby eyes crinkling up to cry in the arms of the old nigger, whose own eyes were nothing but slivers looking down at his feet. But the worst ones were those of the nigger woman, who looked like she didn't have any, since the whites in them had disappeared, and since they were as black as her skin. She looked blind. They unhitched from school teacher's horse the borrowed mule that was to carry the fugitive woman back to where she belonged, and tied it to the fence. Then, with the sun straight up over their heads, they trotted off, leaving the sheriff behind among the damnedest bunch of coons they had ever seen. All testimony to the results of a little so-called freedom imposed on people who needed every care and indulgence in the world to keep them from the cannibal life they preferred. You chose an interesting one. My efforts to think the way committed slaveholders think. The naturalness of their contempt, the effortlessness of their belief in their superiority to these people. Coming in the book at a moment after the reader has been in the lives of these people whom they have categorized as nigger woman, nigger man, nigger baby, nigger boy. But because these characters are so familiar and intimately portrayed, this, I was hoping, section that I read comes with a chill. Not just because of the events of the slaughter, but the way in which, at this point, they are looked at. It's difficult, but I use what I think are methods that maybe actors and actresses use. When you have a vague character, or you try to make it specific, fully realized, and you want to be in that person's head if you're on stage, to wear the clothes, wear the shoes, behave the way that person would. So you have to enter or project and know, where they part their hair and what kind of soap they would wear and what food they don't like, whether or not it appears in the book. You try to imagine all those things. And that works for me. I can suspend, I don't judge my characters that way. Whether I want to have lunch with them or not is something quite different. But you have to love them for the moment of their portrayal. Whether they are men, women, old, young, children, what have you. I frequently know the questions the story is supposed to answer, or I'm provoked, as I was by Margaret Garner. What must that feel like? Or in Paradise, to hear about those people who walked all that distance to get to free black towns and were turned away by black people who had also been slaves like them, and they were not welcome there. I thought, my God, what that must feel like. So I know what the story is about. I sort of know the journey. Now I have to find out who's going to work that out for me. Margaret Garner, I didn't want to know too much about her, what she looked like, etc. I wanted to invent her. So I only need just a few strokes to start. And then I, sort of put them together. So they are never fully realized immediately. They always take currying and coddling and stroking and personal introductions and anything I can do to get them to speak and trust me. No, I won't. I don't want artistic control over other genre being developed from my books. I really do believe that books are singular. Maybe they don't have to remain books, but they certainly are books. And if they're made subsequently into movies, good movies, mediocre movies, great movies, whatever, that's another thing. That's another art form. And the book has to stand on the shelf by itself. And it's a special kind of pleasure in it. The reason I don't want artistic control is because I am a very controlling person when I work. And if I'm not going to make the movie, produce it, choose everybody, fund it, then I don't want to be involved in it as a kind of consultant without power and without knowledge, because I don't know how to make movies, and I don't know how to write screenplays, and I don't want to learn how to do that either. I respect the people who do, and I give them whatever information they solicit from me. But no, I don't want final cut on these things unless I own the whole shop. Well, your students are ahead of you this time. In a way, I wanted Beloved to be both things. I wanted her to be the returned child that Setha longed for, and her daughter, Denver, longed for. They really need her to come back and say, let them work out their expiations on her. But at the same time, the buried scene concerns the Middle Passage. Maybe this girl is a survivor of the Middle Passage, traumatized by it, kept locked up somewhere, is freed with only the memories of what that must have been like. And for me, the two things came together. Resurrection from the dead in order to demand love, which could be the dead baby. Resurrection from slave ship journeys in order to demand love. Those two stories seem to me to be parallel. So I never came down on one side or the other, but there's a clear indication that Beloved is a historical figure rather than a ghost-like figure. I searched around a little bit for something quiet and unobtrusive, but persistent and a bit of a mar to explain something about the characterization of Milkman's mother. And the water stain, you know, if you're a housekeeper, you know they're just impossible to remove. And they are not an overwhelming and dramatic mark, but one that you keep working at. It seemed good and domestic for her. The shift to writing about men was a mighty shift. I thought it would be not so difficult because I had written cameos with men in them before, but to have the book's engine driven by men was far more complicated than I thought it would be, and I had to rely for entrance into that imaginative world on my father, my uncles, and men I knew, and trying to see or render how they saw the world. I think also I was unprepared for the impact that women had on their lives. It wasn't just male bonding, but I can assure you it was a very powerful and different imaginative process that I had to go through to center that book on male protagonists. It's true. She's selected as one of her book club choices, and it sold more as a consequence of that than it had in its entire history, even though it was a very successful publication. It's made an enormous difference. I think even when I was in publishing for over 20 years, that was what we were always hoping would happen. Not just the bestsellers, which takes a certain amount of, work, but just have reading by your everyday books, interesting books, become a habit, a profound habit, not among, the collectors or the academics, but everyday work of taking the time to read a book and being able to argue about it, debate it, quarrel about it, disagree with it. That is what I think Oprah's book club has introduced. I feel that even here on C-SPAN, part of the whole notion of having just conversations with authors about books on television is novel, and people enjoy it. People do it. Local newspapers have their own book clubs, and there are book clubs, neighborhood book clubs, all over this country. I don't give her full credit for all of that, but I certainly have to give her a large portion of it for making it okay to turn off the television and read a book. Well, there was some problem with Freedmen's Bureau when this slave tries to give him information. He says, where were you born? Your parents living or dead, etc. And the man was a little drunk, and he put all this information in the wrong spaces. So his name is Macon Dead. His first name was where he was born, his parents become his last name, etc. I think I was a little overconfident and very arrogant when I began to be well known or known at all, because I was a middle-aged woman. I didn't publish, I didn't write until I was 39 years old. So I had already formed a personality. I was an adult. I was a mother. I had a full-time job. And so the vulnerability of celebrityhood was, I was never interested in it. It had of no interest to me whatsoever. I felt my work was extremely valuable, and that whenever people complimented me, that's what they were complimenting. So it seemed perfectly wonderful to me. It didn't have anything to do with the person who lived inside. Now, so I was mindful of other people's alterations, expectations, changes, the delight you can bring, as well as the resentment, as well as the uses to which people can make of you. I took authors around. I know how that works, you know, as a publicist and as an editor. I know how to solicit the press and how to manipulate it, etc. And I see authors successful or not successful in working with their readership. So I thought I was pretty good at the whole thing. But suddenly, in the late years, and very recently, maybe it's post-Nobel Prize, but it's not really that. I think it's after being a couple of times on Oprah Winfrey's show. And I felt more and more the disadvantages, which always exist, of being well known than the advantages. The advantages are overwhelming. I get to have a powerful, active readership, large. I get to be published in 28 languages, and people really know my work and really quarrel about it, and that is ideal. You can't ask for anything better than that. On the other hand, it has other problems. I dismissed them all because they were of no consequence to me. And now I have to do something else. I have to guard myself or prepare myself for other people. I've never done that in my life. I've always been, whatever it was, always open or closed based on something was going on in me, not about somebody outside. And that is, it just sounds whiny to me to go on about that. And it is whiny. But the problem exists when it comes into the study. There was always the free place for me. Nobody was in there but me, my characters, and the language. Now, when that begins to be meddled with, then I am in trouble. And it hasn't happened, but I feel threatened. And it's something that no one should deal with. It's not the public. This is me. And I was sort of disappointed in myself in responding to this celebrityhood. Sure. I wasn't sure whether she was asking about the love coming out of my soul or Oprah's, but I will tell you the former. I was thinking really not about slavery. I was thinking about the ways in which women love everything more than themselves. Their children, their husbands, their nurturing qualities were so profound. And we were being asked to give those up in order to make greater choices as liberated women, you know, to be more selfish. And that argument between the selfless, nurturing woman and the selfish, narcissistic woman, that line was very close and was difficult to negotiate. That's really what I was thinking about. And then I thought, you know, we're being encouraged to take motherhood as a choice. We don't have to have children. We don't have to yearn for children. And maybe freedom is not having children. Then I thought, but for certain women, to be able to be responsible for their children was the most freedom, the most identity, the most dangerous thing that they could do. And those were slave women, whose children they did not own. They could have the child, but it wasn't theirs. It could be sold at any moment, taken away at any age. So to actually have your child, bear it, and be responsible for it was an act of such revolutionary proportions. It cast a long shadow on contemporary urgings vis-a-vis a woman's place. So the story that I had just read a newspaper article about this woman who said, no, I'm not doing that. This child is mine. Her life is mine. She's my child. I will say how she lives and dies. And of course it was a crime and it was a sin. But on the other hand, it was this other gesture. It was complicated. And that's how I began doing the research on that concept in slavery. Somebody asked me, did I have any children's stories? And I said no. But I did have a story that my son and I, Toni Morrison, when he was a little kid, had some unpleasantness with the teacher, disciplinary. And she had said to him, you have no idea how to use your freedom. And it hurt him so much. So we wrote that. I rhymed it, and he was complaining about it. And then later, these many years later, I submitted it to Hyperion, and they liked it. And we used it as a children's book, but it's a little sly, as you can tell. The kids seem to love it and understand it. It's in 6 different languages now. But it is about freedom and about how personal that is. It gives them things. They just want them happy, but they don't want to talk to them. They don't want to wrestle with them. They want them over there with all their toys, all their PlayStations, all their goodies, pictures of the sky, pictures of the sea, but no real engagement. And the children are begging in all these various environments for an opportunity to just be free, whatever that meant in their own way. Oh, I would only read it in my inestimable, loving voice, and it's like a song. The kids get it instantly. They know. I mean, we really do underestimate the brilliant little kids. We test them and we see them do ballet. We think that's where they're smart. That's not. They don't understand language. They have to find out from all sorts of ways what you really mean. Children know when they're being bought by their parents with toys. They know when they're being, given no freedom whatsoever under the guise of freedom. They understand it fully, and if you don't think so, all you have to do is remember what you knew when you were that age. You knew when the smiles were fake. You knew when people walked in the room and rather you left. You knew when you were being dismissed, even while people were embracing you. That reading that children give is very much a survival instinct in them. Well, I think it's different for different people. I teach creative writing, and I'm always trying to get students to recognize when they're at their best, where and under what circumstances. For me, it's compulsion. It's not discipline. It's not even an effort of the will. It's an inability to not do it. I just cannot not think that way, and I cannot for long not write. For me, it's a kind of an extension almost of reading, which I did all my life and do still. But I am absolutely happiest and at my most, it's risky, it's happy, it's difficult. It is absolutely the place I prefer to be, is working out and solving problems of fiction writing, sentences, this word, that word, and everything I've ever known in the world, everything I've ever read, bits and pieces of that seem to come together and are useful in the construction of fiction for me. Well, the works of nonfiction, for the most part, unless there's ceremonial speeches such as Nobel Prize acceptance speech, etc., the others are academic or political arguments that I am advancing, in which I am absolutely correct. as opposed to the fiction where I can experiment and pose several kinds of questions, be much more ambiguous, and I don't have to prove anything except credibility and truth. But sometimes there are current events that are overwhelming and seem to require thoughtful, a thoughtful kind of essay in order to respond to sometimes directly the subject, but more often the context in which the subject is being discussed and debated. Oh, yes. Well, those definitions have changed so radically. I just call myself an independent, but I'm generally appalled by profoundly conservative ideas. Just appalled. A profoundly conservative idea would be the imposition of one religion on the whole of the society. The imposition of those religions' precepts on the whole of society. I am a Catholic. I know the Catholic Church's position on abortion. I think its imposition on the whole world is a travesty. Those things. And they trouble me greatly because they are inflexible and didactic and autocratic. And all of humanity seems to be moving toward more choices, more subtlety, more freedoms. The art is moving that way. The poets are moving that way. The science is moving that way. And on the other hand, conservation in the political sense has taken on a meaning that is retrograde. You know, it's a preference for the 19th century. Well, I'm glad to hear you describe the ambiguity and the questions. I'm much more interested in questions, intelligent questions, than I am in providing the reader with the answer. This is the answer, close the book. The originality and the mystery and the power of life is in posing those questions. In Beloved, for example, the architecture of the life of Setha met its own criteria of difficulty meeting someone who might be able to give you rest, but falling in love, more difficulty, coming to some conclusion, and the possibility of a happy ending. But what we do is memorable. That girl, Beloved, was the last breath, the last message, the last scent of that book. That haunting, which is the middle passage, all those slaves whom nobody knows, who never made it to this shore, names we can't locate, the dead who are unmourned, unremembered, disremembered, that's not going anywhere. That haunting is the consequence of the solution that Setha had to forget. Well, we all do it. You can't let the past strangle you if you're going to go forward, can you? But nevertheless, the past's not going anywhere. So the point is, you have to deal with those things, the consequences of our actions. It's not so much about the right final thing to do as it is about knowing that whatever we do, the most moral position we take is a complicated one and may have the opposite consequences for somebody else. That negotiation is what life is. How do we respond to it without hurting other people? Seth's situation seemed to me to be classic because, as somebody said, she had every intention of taking herself and her children to another place, a better place. And it was, in the face of that horror, the right thing to do, except she had no right to do it. It's the conundrum and the paradox, which is what makes life interesting, original, in a class by itself, and why it provokes me into writing such books. I have a place now, finally, after all these years. I used to write in the kitchen, any place I could find. But I have a study in my house. I live near the Caller, just down the road from Piermont, in Grandview. And it's right on the Hudson. So I can look at the water all the time while I'm writing in my own study. It's exhausting, and it's great, delicious, difficult work. It's hard. For me, it's slow. I have to write over so much. I have to reselect, reshape so much. But it's so rewarding when it's close to where you really think that note should be struck. Once in a while, it goes along at a clip, and it's sort of lovely, and it rests there and even survives in the final book that way. For me, it doesn't happen that way much. But the process for me is totally engaging, totally mesmerizing. I get very vague about everything else. And it's the lights are right on what I'm doing. And when I'm not doing it, even when I was coming down here, I'm thinking about a book that I am in the process of writing now, and I hear phrases that strangers say that remind me of things that characters believe, or activities that I remember. We were talking about the old Liberty Boy. Liberty magazine, for those of you too young to remember, was a well-known magazine that cost a nickel, and it used to be sold door to door. And the person who sold it, we called, was usually a kid, newspaper type, job, the Liberty Boy, and was laughing about the Liberty Boys with somebody. And it occurred to me that that was exactly what a certain character had done. So all of life then becomes the canvas, shrunk, reorganized for the book. So the process is now always there, always with me. I was fortunate in having learned as a teacher how to say to a student, "This is terrible," in language that was diplomatic enough and constructive enough so that the student could go ahead and fix it. I was also fortunate in that little writers club I mentioned before, in having experienced that kind of criticism myself, where people would put to me serious questions. And I knew that it wasn't about me personally, it was about the work, which was perhaps more personal. But I also knew that I was a much more fastidious reader than anybody I thought I knew, and a much more fastidious critic. So I thought I was more severe than anybody else. And also, but I wasn't so severe as some writers are, that they can't send it out. They keep fretting it, keep picking at it, waiting for it to be sublime, and it never gets done. So there's an element of risk where you send it out, even though it's not the flawless, perfectly pitched thing you want it to be. But criticism, you first listen and see if it is helpful. Then dismiss it, because it may not be. Well, he was very important to me in a very specific way. I obviously admired him in any number of ways: his courage, his intellect, his ferocity, mostly his clarity. In language, he was very important to me because he was able to talk about very serious situations of race and violence and love in language that was both scathing and at the same time loving. Extraordinary feats he accomplished in a kind of truth-telling manner that I hadn't heard before. He wasn't calling names, he wasn't posing, he wasn't even vengeful. There was an elegance to his language that was about race but was not racist. And I just never had experienced that kind of language before in the 50s and 60s. So I owe him for teaching me that there was such a thing as that kind of language. I owe James Baldwin that. You know, I have to tell you, I shouldn't admit it, I thought about that myself. And I suggested it to an editor who thought it was hilarious and unworthy, I suppose. But no, I'm not a poet, but I do think now that poetry is something other than, in addition to whatever its many forms, it's also free. Some of the best poetry are just really first-rate sentences, really good sentences, two really good sentences. And when I write, I try to write prose that is as clear and as simple as possible, as imagistic as possible, and I rewrite them so often so that nothing interferes with the picture I'm trying to represent or the voice of the character. And I know that those are strategies that poets use. So I won't declare myself to be a poet because I haven't got that education and I don't have that flair. But I'm glad that you think that my sentences are what I call first-rate prose, with rhythm, with music, with shape, and with meaning. No, I did originally. When I wrote Beloved, I had in mind 3 stories of the same theme, of variations of human love, love of a mother for children, a romantic love, and spiritual love. And I call the whole thing Beloved for all sorts of complicated reasons. And then when I did the first part and finished the part about the slavery, I told my editor, I'm sorry, I just know I've exhausted all this time, but I've only got 1/3 of it. And he thought that I had written a book, and so therefore we would publish it, and I just had to recast the ending, etc., which we did. And then the next story, which turned out to be jazz, was also based on a sort of historical anecdote, really, about a young girl who had let herself die in order to let her lover, who had shot her, get away. And I thought that was ultimately the most romantic, sort of silly, but young people would do something Romeo and Juliet like that. And it struck me that that was very much the kind of love situation that I was looking for. So it's a trilogy with quotes around it. I never really affected it, but I certainly did have the thread of these varieties of love of women, primarily, although it didn't work out that way always. Parental love, romantic love, and love of God. Well, I use my own experience in reading what kind of characters are memorable to me, or the ones I dream about or can never forget. And I noticed, as many people have, that the ones that are overdrawn and forgettable because there's no place for my imagination. I can't cooperate with the writer in inventing the character. So frequently my characters have fewer physical characteristics, some sort of broad strokes and a few small strokes, but I want them to be made up and invented, not only by me, but by the reader as well. I remember a woman who said she knew Pilate, a figure in Song of Solomon. And I said, well, that was difficult for me because she was such an overwhelming character in my mind. I had to shut her up. It wasn't her story. So I gave these very powerful, colorful descriptions of what she looked like, and what her gestures were, and the impact she had on other people. But it was an open character so that the reader could begin to add the details and hear her speak or think or watch other people around her. all I'm saying is that it's a technique for making characters fully realized, not only for the purposes of writing, but also someone that the reader is working at the same time, building that character, understanding it, justifying, or being repelled by, or what have you. The reader has to be in that text, and it's my job as a writer is to make spaces for the reader to enter and feel what you described earlier, the comfort to hear about a story that's not pleasant, that is tragic, and to not feel as though you are excluded from it, that this is something you and I share along with the characters. Well, there are two reasons for a very, I suppose, unnecessarily elaborate process I go through in naming the characters. I always have this feeling that I really have to know their names in order to write about them. I have to kind of introduce myself, and it's my job to find out who they are. And sometimes I call them by names and nothing happens. I called Eva Ada for years, and I couldn't get anything going. When I finally figured out, no, it was Eva, then I was able to, sort of develop characteristics for her. Some of the names are odd and strange, not for any reasons of, providing kicks or anything, but part of it is because I have to know their names, even if I have to search among names. The other is the way in which African Americans, particularly in certain areas, got their names and their reaction to the process of naming. We were given other names, seldom kept or were permitted to keep names that we brought from various continents or nations in Africa. The whole X business, you may remember in the 70s, Malcolm X, was a reaction to that. Now people give their children names that are African-like names. So this is the serious position of a kind of cultural orphanage that African Americans are dealing with in a very special and unique way. Denying their master's name, renaming, identifying ourselves with ancestors from abroad, or claiming names that are names that show one's vulnerability. Nicknames have a very special place, or used to have a very special place in African American communities because they were very specifically painful. They were not pretty names. It was as though parents were saying, this is what you're going to have to deal with. Get used to it now. So you find names like Milkman, which is about a, for him, embarrassing period. And also I remember my father's friends who all had names. I don't even know what the real names were. Or think, indeed, about musicians' names, particularly in the 20s and 30s. They had nicknames, unattractive names that they were known by. And what it is claiming. It's kind of agency in making up your own name or giving a name to somebody else. It's a very complicated thing, but you mix that in, that whole process of naming, with my own writerly, inventions about how to get in touch with my own characters, then you have somebody who's entangled in the process of naming. Well, my original editor, the one who has edited most of my books, Robert Gottlieb, was at Knopf, who did Sula through Beloved. And then afterwards he went on to, he left Knopf and began to edit The New Yorker. Since then he is, I think, available, his good offices for any subsequent projects I have. He was really, truly first-rate editor. I I think it's because I respect that work. I know that there are many writers who don't, and I don't know if it's because they're never had a good editor or it's just the way in which they write, but I know that a first-rate editor is like a first-rate anything. Someone who does not correct you so much as give you the information, allow you the spaces to make the best decisions, call your attention to things that are sliding by. That's invaluable, that word for word, line by line reading of a text. It's the kind of thing I tried to give when I was an editor, and certainly my editor did. I don't know that there's much time for that now in publishing because it's much more rapid and people are promoted based on skills other than those. Those skills, it's like a craft as well as an art, are not rewarded financially the way skills of making deals are. So I think it's narrowing considerably. You find fewer and fewer people not able to do it, but rewarded for doing it, you see. So I was very lucky in the fact that I knew how to edit, and also lucky in the knowing a first-rate editor, a superb editor, who complimented, helped me, and I valued it. I didn't find it interference or at all. Well, I'm delighted that there's so many kinds of writers from so many backgrounds and ethnicities. It's really a delight to read young people now. I think, we're encouraged to believe that there's something about writing that is sort of perfect and flawless and doesn't involve race. It's confusing because every excellent classical book that we've ever read or been taught is all about its race, its people, its region. Even if that race happens to be the white race, it's still about that. Young writers shouldn't be afraid or even discouraged from including specifically racial matters in their texts. It doesn't have to lose race in order to be valuable. That's a trick, that you have to surpass or transcend race in order to enter the pantheon of literature. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous on its face because that it only is applicable to black people. Nobody asks anybody else in the world to transcend race other than black people. But you don't have to use it as a kind of crutch, as a kind of finger pointing. It's not, as you seem to be suggesting, also is a ploy. It's not good literature because it's about black life. Just as books are not good because they're about, Polish life or Irish life. The point is that you use whatever is important to the story. Currently, I think there is some debate about the uses to which the culture functions in literature. And I would advise any young writers to do, if you're not going to be free in that area to make your own choices, where on earth, can you be free? You can write detective stories that have never mentioned the race of the people who are involved, unless it's important. Love stories, the same way. I mentioned detective stories because I read a lot of detective stories, and I'm aware of so many written by, say, African Americans that have no mention of race in it, or by white people that are about race. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the choices are wider. It's an embarrassment of riches as far as what can be done that young writers should take advantage of, but not to think that the absence of racial identification is necessarily a plus. That's what I was trying to suggest. I really don't think I can tell you how. The point is to recognize it when you write it. So I would recommend that you experiment with opening passages, for example, some of which are I, first person, some of which may be he or she, some of them which may be you, take the sort of omnipotent voice that is speaking directly. Play. And then at some point, you'll find a voice that you think is merely appropriate for the narrative that you're writing, and then learn later that it's part of your own voice. But you do have to play. Don't expect to get it the first time. You may, but if you don't, if you don't love revision and rewriting as a writer, you should stop right now, because that's what it is. It's doing it over and over and over until you get it right. I think learning how to love somebody and learning how to love yourself and your children, learning how to love is what human beings do. It's almost like learning how to sink. And we learn it better if we are serious and exposed to it. When you think about what it is, I just described 3 books that were involved in love. How to love a child, how to love yourself, how to love a lover, how to love God. There used to be all these things we could love, and they were not embarrassing to us. Now we want to open that up. How does a woman really love a child? It's not automatic. Caring for children may be, worrying about children may be, protecting children may be, but that's not the same thing. When they're grown up, who they are, when it's specific, what do you do? These are very complicated problems to me. And it seems to me to be the thread that undergirds or supports so much human activity is where does our self-esteem come from? Where does our self-loathing come from? Why are we so driven in this direction? What are these little pains and hurts? And it surrounds this question of being deprived of love, being bereft of it, therefore never knowing quite how to express it. At the same time, love so powerful, so desperate, that you destroy the thing you love most in the world, that you love God so that you're just absolutely transported by it, and the love is so complete and so absolute that you can't bear other people who have another idea about it and don't agree with your love, and therefore you expel or kill them. To have your whole life broken apart by or made perfect by romantic love, and then to lose the... you can see as I'm rambling on and on that these are not simple things, and it's much larger than somebody not having love, being abused, and then abusing somebody else. Even if we're ideal, where the family is the most loving family in the world, it's never going to be that flat, that simple, and that predictable. It just seems to me that there's nothing more interesting, compelling, mysterious, and unpredictable, as the human heart. I was stepping out of the shower, I think. Phone rang. A friend of mine was on the phone. A woman who was very instrumental in bringing me to Princeton. Ruth Simmons is her name. And she was on the phone and she said, "You won." And I said, "Won what?" And she said, "The Nobel Prize for Literature." And I thought instantly that she couldn't know anything that I didn't know about something as important as that. And I said, "Who told you that?" And she said she just heard it on television. So then I knew it wasn't true so I told her to sleep on it a little bit and call me back later. I really just dismissed it. It was so remote. It never crossed my mind. It was not anything that I ever thought about. So her telling me that just seemed odd. And also I had seen the media rush over to all sorts of people with cameras and journalists ready to record their words upon having received not only that prize, but other prizes, only to be told that that person didn't win. I mean, that happened a couple of times in my presence, so I was totally unimpressed with what she had to say. And then the phone started ringing constantly. And then I got dressed and I went to work. I went to my class, and the campus was full of reporters and telephone calls, those big fat cable lines. And I thought, well, I guess it's true, but it was out there, you know, it wasn't really in my head. And also, I had not heard from the Swedish Academy. They didn't say I had won. So all these people may be misled. So I asked them to send, when they finally called, about 12 or 1 o'clock that afternoon, I asked them to send me a fax. My mother was. Oh, it was wonderful. I was so glad she was still alive. She didn't fully understand the level of the prize, but she knew it was important, so she got to enjoy it. No, she was too sick for that. To deliver the acceptance speech and a kind of lecture that they want the literary winners to do, very much like the scientific ones give scientific papers, I thought I would try very hard to give a speech that did enact what the subject was, which was the value of narrative, that it is the major form in which we acquire knowledge. We set it up as a narrative. There are other forms, symbolical and musical, but narrative is the major way in which we absorb knowledge and remain intelligent. And the stories we tell, the invention of them, is a learning process and an intellectual process. So that's what I wanted to say, how valuable literature was. But I didn't want to just say that. I wanted to theatricalize it. So I made up a story, once upon a time, and I used an old story that every culture has about the blind woman or man who's presented with a bird and asked to say whether the bird is living or dead. And the old person says, "I don't know," to the young person holding the bird, "but it's in your hands." And it's pregnant, you know, with all sorts of meaning. But I wanted to use the situation of that encounter between the old, the wise, the blind, and the young, and give the young agency to really talk back to the old person and say, "What are you, tricking us?" You know, and have the two of them debate, argue, and come to the third place. Well, you know, I was the only woman. I told them they have to give me more time, or give women more time if they're going to give that prize out to women, because not only do you have to write a speech that's worthy, you have to find something to wear. The men just come in tuck. They just rent a tux, they're ready. And if you're like me and you're not interested in clothes, it took forever. So I felt very representational. I felt female. I felt American. I felt writerly. I felt like an Ohioan. I took all these responsibilities of representation on. And I felt like the first black woman, right? I felt all of that, which was really serious, but at the same time, it was a kind of protection. So I wouldn't have to shoulder it all as me. You know, I could sort of redistribute myself out there a little bit. And for me, living in the moment happens after the moment. It's only upon reflection, much later, that I knew what I felt. And what I felt was so happy, unabashedly thrilled, joyous, delight. There was no false modesty. I didn't sort of say, oh, shucks, who me? I really enjoyed it. It was the most glorious party with the most generous people in the world. So it was as good as it gets. That's a big problem for novice writers as well as writers who've written a long, long time. You can't love it too much. I learned that more with my second book than anything else. The technical is the expression of the spiritual. Eudora Welty's work is radiant because of her technical expertise and the way she works it. You cannot rely on simply this sort of inspirational connection. It's like talking to a character, and they talk all the time, and they want you to do this, and you have to suddenly realize they're not writing that book. I am. This is my book. I write over and over again. I am not afraid to write badly anymore because I can write it over. I used to get so discouraged after writing something an hour, 2 hours, it was just awful. And I thought I could never, it's ridiculous. You throw it away and you write it again and then again. And you don't love it because you did it. The first rule is probably if you love it a little too much, it's probably not very good. So you just work it. And your process has to be one that is fulfilled. Don't hesitate to write that sentence another way, a second way, move the clause, another adjective, because that is, you know, how one works. And it isn't because you failed. It's because you're in the process of shaping something that is beautiful and meaningful by using these very tiny stitches, little hammers, tools. They go together. You are a jeweler. You are creating a diamond, or you are a gardener, or you are a painter. But all of those things require technique, practice. Oh, well, I'm not going to list any 5 particular because, you know, I've been reading a long, long time, and I'm going to leave out somebody who has been a major education for me. And because also I read books 5 and 6 years later, some that I thought were mediocre and turned out to be absolutely fantastic, or things that I thought were flawless and later turn out not to be, but more often things that have just stayed and taught more and more and more each time I go back, revisiting them. And the books seem to change, although in fact I may have. So they're classical books I have affinities for. I mean, I can't explain. I remember a long time I spent years with Italo Svevo for some reason, and then George Meredith, and then, you know, and it was inexplicable. And then suddenly I went back, you know, to Chekhov. And then all of a sudden I couldn't get enough of Kamara Lai. And recently I've been reading, after many, many years, Chinua Achebe. You read for different reasons at different times, and you fall in love over and over again. But it is a little dismissive for me to rank those authors because they're, you know, constant loves. Yeah, a couple days ago, I was reading a biography of Colette by somebody whose name I've forgotten already. Very interesting, very quite recent, which is to say I do read a lot of biography. Less autobiography, a great deal of biography. I read, when I'm traveling, quick stories. I read a lot of detective stories. Yes. And I read a lot of literary theory. I'm just reading a book on King Leopold. So I read a lot of academic things. I just read White Teeth by this girl, Zodi Smith. I thought that was quite good. When people send me books and I am able to get to them, and I finished Peter Carey's book recently, which I loved a lot, of the contemporary fiction, which I look for, and sometimes am delighted with finding something right off the shelf, so to speak. Those two I've read recently. Well, it was difficult for me because it was writing about things that were unpleasant and imagining things I didn't really want to imagine. So that's why the theme is forgetting. Everybody in the book is trying to forget or not saying anything about it, in the same way that African Americans did try to forget and not say anything about in order to go forward. In the same way that I, as the writer, was trying to manage. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to think about it. So it became all for all of us. What do you do with memory? Or what I called in the book rememory. Because it is hard. Because it is not happy. But my feeling was, too, if I didn't have to live it, all I had to do was write about it. Then I should stop whining and stop feeling all sort of precious and just do it. Also, I felt, as is true in every life, if you don't know your history, your personal history, you don't have a future. All you do is tread water. You can't get beyond that. It takes a little courage. You do feel bad reliving or encountering this, but it has to be worth it. So I tried in Beloved to say, everybody in here is unhappy about this ghost, but they're dealing with it. And you can too. And because I know that slavery is very hard for black people to try to remember or recreate calmly, it's impossible. For white people to do the same thing, it's difficult for them. So instead of, ignoring that, I would distract them a little bit and have them concentrate on this ghost as the most important thing, while I fed them little sips of slavery so that they didn't have to look it straight in the eye and swallow it whole. They could look askance, as it were, and concentrate on something else while they were being, sort of inundated with this other horror story. I mean, the point being, people said, well, why a ghost in a book about slavery? There are some good technical reasons and logistic reasons. But in addition to those, it was clear to me that the ghost story is the least amazing of those tales. The most amazing and the most outrageous and unbelievable is the slave story. If you can believe in the slave story, believing in a ghost takes nothing. But it was a kind of sleight of hand that I would decided upon in order to make those two ideas palatable so that the reader would be willing to go there. The movie is a different thing. That's so much external images. And the nature of a movie is to be blatant. It's right up there in your face, sort of frontal. For me, as a writer, I don't have to be blatant. The scene of the actual slaughter of the baby is buried in the text. I can't even find it. I don't know where to go. But you know it happened. You think it happened. You want to know why it happened. But the actual description of it is very short. Seen from 2 or 3 points of view, one of which I read earlier, and sort of buried. It's the effluvia around it, the consequences of it, the preparation for it that takes up more of the book. I have this sense that I'm not doing anything. I don't know, maybe it's being a depression child where everybody had to have 4 little jobs in order to, I don't know what it is. But when I stop and think, and I'm looking at these books piled on your table, and this looks like so much. And I do work, and I do lecture, and I do write things other than novels, and I write lyrics. Beautiful. Beautiful. Some of them are beautiful, but it's something I like a lot. But I've always done the impression, I've got to get over this at my age, that there's something I'm not doing, something extremely important that I forgot, and that if I don't hurry up, I won't have a chance to do it. And the other thing seems simple, too, because, as I said before, I don't remember myself before I could read, and that's what I do. Well, I publish books, I teach books, I read books, I write books. So it seems that it's very simple and uncluttered, because I don't know how to ski, and I don't know how to row boats, and I don't know how to mount, I read. Yeah, I do. I don't go on vacation, and I live at a nice place. I love there. I love the place, like the way it looks. I never want to leave it. And my idea is, in addition to, I don't know, friends, dinner, gardening, and reading. That's about it. It's a conundrum for me, but racially and just as a person is, for him, obviously, he is seduced by this wide-spirited love of this beautiful country he's a fugitive in, and he doesn't have the security to settle or to just love it. And his solution is to love a little bit so that you have a little left over the next time. My feeling is we belong here. I mean, we meaning all of us. We belong here. There isn't, as far as we know, any other place. We cannot tolerate the abuse of this place that we belong in, and we cannot tolerate other people dictating how we shall relate to it. So in that sense, I had been feeling fairly optimistic that there's more likely to be people who don't feel the way Paul D. did in that situation, but who feel that they were in their, on the shore, that the river's theirs to love, to enjoy, and to inhabit. And all that's necessary, of course, is some guarded and maybe very active resistance to those who believe that it's not ours. Oh, I think sometimes Song of Solomon looks like the one that people can get into rather quickly. I think Sula probably also. Many people have read The Bluest Eye when they were very young. I know, I don't quite understand that, because it's not a children's book at all. It is about children and told from a child's point of view, but it's a very adult subject. And I know that there are young people, particularly young girls, who read the story when they're 12 and 13 and are terrified by it. And it just doesn't sit well with them until much later. So I always wonder, I always ask them, how'd you feel? Well, the subject matter was a little outrageous for them. I thought that was quite a little revolutionary topic at that time in 1972 and 3. Not that there haven't been stories about women before, but when women were friends, close friends, in most classical literature of Europe and England, the point of the friendship was about men, how to get married, advice on marriage, housekeeping, etc. It was never about the friendship itself. The friendship we knew was just a means to another end, which was the husband or the lover, or what have you. So I was interested in women the friendship was about that, not about their other lives, but about that relationship. So I chose two people that were very close, but were very much unlike each other, very much unlike, to see if I could examine how that friendship was made and what would be the collapse of it. And obviously it would be betrayal with a man, and whether it could ever survive that, whether it was valuable enough to survive that sexual betrayal, which is the most outrageous for men and women, I suppose, but certainly that form of betrayal is profound. So I wanted to test the friendship. Well, it's interesting, the value, as you describe it, of the conventional, traditional way. There's a lot of value in that. And then the Catholicism of the nun who takes in contemplate. I mean, it's beautiful, exquisite. It's, it's the Protestant traditionalism, the Catholic traditionalism. And then there's this third thing, which is a kind of a remnant of contemplate, kind of combination of Africanist religions and Catholicism as practiced in places like Brazil, a little animistic, etc. And to mix them together in a way in which to say, I suppose, which is not terribly original, is that, the worst thing you can say about religions are the people who practice it, who use it and have other agenda of power, of empire, of control, which is usually not the seed or the kernel of the religion itself. The institutionalization of these absolutely beautiful, generous, wonderful ideas, which is religion, which is spirituality, rituals. Those are the good things. And then, of course, you have, people, such as the men in the town, unlike their wives in paradise, who use the religion in order to expand their empire. Or you have a woman like Contemplate, who was a very devoted Catholic, but who was abandoned by Catholicism. And nobody was there to take care of her. So she had to invent a third thing. So it's not so much which of these things is right. It's just that we lose the love and the mystery and the generosity of religion. If it's not generous, and if it's only based on the hierarchy of exclusion, then it seems to me that therein lies the rub, when the problem becomes not the traditional or the new. It becomes in the hearts of people when the people aren't good enough for the religion that they espouse. That's good to know what it means, because my mother was annoyed because her name was chosen by somebody opening the Bible and putting their finger down, very much the way it happened in a book I wrote called Song of Solomon, where Pilate got her name that way. And I think in the passage that was identified, it was called Ramah, which she and her parents and all of us pronounced Ramah. But she said it was a village. And I never searched further to see if the village had a meaning. And it would have been nice had she been alive to know that it means mercy. Aunts, their mothers, my sister, the women I thought were fierce, powerful, loving women. Very. It's a skippy part. It's the one that no one's supposed to read but me. So I have sometimes disguised them and sometimes been forthright about them, but it's all very subjective. No, they're very different for me. Different obstacles I set myself. Different kinds of success that I think I've achieved, or things I was not able to do. Some of the ones that get the most attention are not the ones that were most satisfying to me as an artist. Sometimes the stories overwhelm, in the public's mind, the art. I'm interested in the story, but for me, when I say process, I mean the art of doing it. And sometimes it's just so hard to do it and make it appear effortless that when I'm able to do it well, that becomes something special, even though the book itself may not be as well regarded as some of the others. Oh, to demonize them. These are human beings. It's not that you're required to approve at all. You simply to understand how this human being got to be that kind of human being, which means it's a possibility for that human being to be something else. No one is, contrary to what we may think from the press, just one thing. There's some other things going on. And that's what perception is about, is perceiving, understanding, and knowing another person. How you judge that person ultimately is your business, but judge them based on knowing all you can about the character, just not that one act. I'm not sure, but I would be afraid of it. I would be afraid of only or heavily emphasized test scores. I think it's just good for the people who record the progress to know what the test scores are. For me, it's a little frightening. I know children who do extremely well on tests, comprehensive reading tests, vocabulary tests, certain structure tests, and make excellent grades. But when but they can't see, they can't visualize, literally, a story. When you say, can you see it? They understand it, they can remember it, but they can't visualize it. That seems to me to be more and more the case. When young people want to visualize something, they go to the cinema or they go to the screen. And if that's not helpful to them, then there's a sort of a blank. In other words, we're not going to literature for that part of the imaginative process. And that will never be taught, never be learned, never be relished simply by emphasizing national tests. It's amazing. I've never seen all those books. It's very much there, that I know people study it in a variety of courses, not just the English department, and they lend themselves to a number of arguments and essays. They lend themselves, my books do, to investigation, like a field. It's true in Germany, it's true in Italy, it's true in Japan, it's true in France, it's true in England, and I'm just delighted to know that it means that many of my books have worked their way into the academy and into the discourse, in the literary discourse, to be there. I probably am and resent it a little bit. My graduate school was, new criticism, where everything was only the art and the language, and certainly not the autobiography, and certainly not the milieu out of which it came. So it took me a little while to withdraw from that. I understand the value of the purely new criticism reading, particularly when it came in the 50s. But I got very much enchanted by deconstruction, because it opened up the literature for me in a way in which I liked it. It's true, I'm not supportive of the very specialized jargon, and I think it, like most schools of thought, opens itself up for misreading, well, more importantly, for fakes. But any good idea opens itself up for fakes. But that kind of postmodernist criticism was very interesting to me. It was a way for all sorts of things to happen in literature that the new criticism made intolerable. I don't know what it was like for him. James Baldwin wrote plays and novels and poetry and these really marvelous essays. I think I explained earlier for another question that for me, the difference is, like, I can't write when I teach, because teaching is very analytical. You're taking something apart, you're shaping an argument, you're trying to persuade or at least open up something in an essay where you convince somebody that this is probably. But fiction writing for me is open to surprise. I want to be available for wilderness in a way that I'm not when I do an essay. It's looser, it's freer, I can range wider. In the actual writing of it, I have to pull all those things together and make it work, like a watch, secretly, behind the face, so to speak. So the process of thinking for me is different. And then certain topics just are not fiction topics for me. They require, I'm interested in something happening, I may be interested in a whole school of things, but they don't suggest narrative, they suggest nonfiction to me. That happened with some of the books that are collected here. They just seem to require a certain kind of essay, not just mine, but other people's, in order to address. Well, my, being good and doing good, that is having a moral sensibility, has always been more interesting to me, more complicated an idea than evil. Evil, it seems to me, gets more play, theatricus. People are attracted to it. It has a top hat, so to speak, and a costume, and it speaks the loudest. But it's really boring, fundamentally, because it can sort of refine new ways to do the same thing. In a sense, it's a sham, screaming all the time like a petulant child. And we fall for it. The press falls for it. If it bleeds, it leads. And it's just numbing and boring. On the other hand, artistically, we have treated good as boring. Dante's Paradiso is like, who reads it? Everybody reads the Inferno and maybe a little Purgatory. We're much more interested in Goethe's Faust, when Faust is, seduced. And by the time we get to Paradise, it's like everybody begins to yawn. And it always seemed to me to be just the opposite. I understand that people had to be chased away from living a corrupt life by knowing how horrible it was going to be for them if they ended up in hell. And Paradise was always like no work and lots of food and you don't have to do much. So I think we've inherited a concept that is just, it's destructive. So that's a long speech to tell you that for me, what's interesting is the negotiation of a moral position. Do no harm. Love somebody and respect yourself, and do some work you respect. All of that is reduced, simplified notions. The philosophers have spent their lifetime trying to imagine what it is like to live a moral life, what morality is, what existence is, what responsibility is. So, and literature does it in another way, and depends a little bit on some of the simplistic things I've said and some of the more complicated and more subtle things that are revealed in large philosophical schools of thought, and certainly some of the all over the world, people who have thought about this problem. It is the problem. Maybe the world needs us to think about it, since nobody else seems to be. I mean, cabbages are not thinking about it. Somebody's got to think about it. So here we are, human beings, a little bit of time. Some people are going to be born later. Some people have already been born. What are you going to do? You're going to do something you respect. You're going to try to find out what's going on, and you're going to try not to contribute to other people's grief. I can understand causing pain if I don't know what it feels like. But if I know what it feels like, if I know what physical pain feels like, if I know what rejection feels like, if I know what humiliation, shame, contempt, and hatred feels like, I can't give that back to you, because I know that hurts. Now, there might be something I can do out of ignorance that might cause you pain, but not that. Now, that seems to me to be figuring that out, as small and as narrow as that concept is much more interesting than trying to figure out how to take something away, how to make people believe exactly the way I do, how to strangle somebody, how to express myself violently. It just seems more interesting to me. So in that sense, a larger than a religious sense, that has informed a great deal of what I have been working on. Oh my, I can't imagine myself not being a mother, even though a good part of my life I wasn't. In a funny way, being a mother was extremely liberating for me. I know that people think of it as, added responsibility, narrowing perhaps of one's choices. You could never sort of leave, as farmers used to say, have a brother who had a farm, can't leave the stock, so he couldn't go anywhere. And it has that feeling, I think, for many people. But in another sense, it just freed me up. It freed me up, and I didn't have to conform to certain other roles, expectations, because, paying attention to my children, actually listening to them, recognizing who they were, was hard for me. At the same time, it was a delight for me. It was the only thing that was of more importance to me than writing. It took precedence over everything I did. And their demands of me were entirely different from what other people demanded of me. The things that other people cared about, they didn't. And what they demanded of me, the reason it was so liberating, was because I could deliver it. They wanted me competent, first of all, and they wanted me to have a sense of humor, and they wanted me to be able to deal with emergencies and not collapse, and to be able to reproduce these things in a safe way so that they could do it. They asked these things of me, and they were, as we were discussing earlier, I could see in their face when I was not delivering it, when I was faking, as it were, pretending. They knew it instantly. And so it freed me up to be this complicated person I thought I always was. I like to laugh. I do laugh. It's agency. It's control. It's healthy. It's literally healthy. My mother had a stroke, and if she hadn't been a laugher, she would have lost control of her left side. the doctors had told us since, because she was this person who was deep, like her father, my grandfather, laughed, tears streaming down your face. And it was infectious, and it was marvelous. And I know culturally, we've been described, African Americans, as sort of silly people, not taking life too seriously, happy slaves, because laughter was part of it, of how we behaved. Laughter is a very complicated process. Not only do you return agency to yourself, sometimes it's self-mockery, sometimes it's a mocking of other person, but you see irony, you see paradox, you see the outrageousness of it all, and it gives you the ability to do. There's a moment in Beloved after Setha tries to kill everybody and runs amok, and the people find out about it, and these two men are talking about her. And what has happened is so awful. They just begin to laugh. It doesn't mean that they are silly or simple-minded. It just means they understood the complicated, parodic, dark, plus excessive, plus lunatic aspect of life. And that they began to manipulate it the moment they began to laugh at it. And also, as I said, it is for, not the little fake social laughter, but for stress management. And I think if you have that streak of humor, the more stress you're under, the more likely you are to just burst out laughing. Well, flight for me was part of an African myth about black people before they were enslaved were able to fly. And when they came to this country, they couldn't do it. But there were these exceptions that are in the myth of Georgia Sea Island people, for example, and in the trying to locate what slave stories were like. People always ask that question. Did you ever hear of anybody who could fly? And people said no, or they said yes, but they never said, what are you talking about? Flying. They had all heard. And it's a universal theme. Everybody wants to fly. I mean, Icarus and all. So I took what I thought was very specific and very general, the notion of flight as a kind of high point in the spiritual, intellectual development of a human being. And so he goes through various things. In the ground, he goes on the ground, he goes in water, in the baptism and river scenes, and then he leaps into this element, which is the most unreliable element there is, as opposed to water and ground. But he goes there in this moment of complete generosity and confidence and risk. So that's his flight. On the other hand, there's the woman. Flight is a male thing. They're always flying. Women are presumably gatherers, and they stay on the ground. But Pilate's imagination, her clarity, her inner beauty, she had already acquired that. He felt, and I felt too. So she didn't need the theatrics of flight when she was already there. And he, at his moment, when he's as close to her as he's ever been in his life, realizes that she had already achieved the goal of flight without ever having left the ground. Are you having trouble? You have to ask her, your mother. That doesn't mean anything that you can't ask her. You really have to ask her. You have to talk to her, and you have to ask her. She'll tell you. You know she will. But only you can interpret the signs and hear her voice. Yeah. But there's nobody better, in a better position to tell you, A, whether to do it, when to do it, how to do it, and to give you the information. I'll answer the second question first. Wait a little bit before you read it. Don't read it if you're 10. Wait till later. Ask your parents. And what made me write it was just my heart was breaking when I thought about that little girl not being worthy of a book in the world. I had an initial hostility to the notion. And then I got a sample of an ebook, and I looked at it. It was easy to handle. I read something on it and was very disturbed, and I couldn't finish it, and I didn't like the color, and I didn't like the text, and I was very uncomfortable. And then I read on it, they had already, had these books in, Jack London's Seawolf, which I haven't read since I was a kid. And I punched it up on the screen, and in 2 seconds, well, maybe 2 paragraphs, I was totally in the book and did not know I was reading on the screen. Now, that's a big thing for me, because I've been going around saying, well, you have to have the book, you have to touch it, you have to turn the pages. And then I realized something, that the power of the narrative is the thing, not whether it's on screen or whether it's in a book. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I don't think they're competitive. I think there will be people who will always read books, want books, don't want to look at it on screen. I talked to young people, and they said they would love, they're more attuned to screen use, they would love that better. So I say all of that to answer your question as saying, I have no problem with my books being on screen as ebooks. My only problem is the share of the profits. I think it's a little bit more complicated than just self-contempt. Every group has a contemptible or contemptuous word for itself. It's a kind of survivalist strategy. But that word seems to be going rapidly out of favor in certain groups of African Americans themselves. I heard it a lot when I was very young among African Americans as a kind of word of endearment, affectionate name-calling, a kind of toughness about it. But I hear that less and less. And I suspect that eventually it would be weird. It's like words get these auras, pickaninny, these sort of old racist terms that just fall out of favor. Where it seems to still have currency is in among the very young male, perhaps rap/style, lyrical qualities, because it has a force for them. It's almost like a curse word, and curse words can only work if they're illegal and if they have force. Once you take the force out and the illegality, they don't work anymore, you see. And a lot of words that used to be curse words are now in the language, and nobody bats an eye. I say all that to say that I think that was what is going to happen with the so-called N-word. I wouldn't worry about it too much right now. Those two go together for me. I don't find them different at all. I think art should be political, representative, and absolutely and irrevocably beautiful at the same time. Yeah, the reporter's question was certainly not about that. It was a routine, predictable question about why doesn't a black writer write about white people? I thought it was silly and ridiculous. Nobody ever asked a white writer why he didn't write about black people, because it's a non-literary question, and it's fundamentally a stupid one. So I was responding to what I knew was the encouragement of a reporter to make me comment on the sociological aspect of being an artist, not the art itself. But as you just suggested, I mean, people should be able to write about anything they want. I mean, anything, anybody. All you have to do is know it. I should be able to write about Chinese people. And what would prevent me from doing it is I don't know anything about it. And I haven't respected their history enough to do the research on it. I have only listened to superficial, that kind of thing would prevent me. It's the same kind of thing I would expect if white writers write about black people. All you have to do is respect the people you're writing about. Get interested enough, not use it as a, harangue, and it's entirely open. This is not a ghetto world that art lives in. It does, and still, I think there are several references to it in some of my books. because it's such an unnatural thing. I could say the same thing about not black-white relations, but wet nurses, you know, that were so common in England and in France, where women of a certain class sent their children away to be nursed by strangers and brought back when they were, you know, sort of housebroken, so to speak. So that passed along into the culture, with black and white relations being the focal point, because the wet nurses were slave women. So you're thinking as a writer, well, how must that feel? So you think about it yourself. I've had children, I've breastfed them. Suppose I were in a position where one of my jobs was, in addition to my own children, I had to feed other children. And it wouldn't be a problem for me or any woman. But if that child that I breastfed at 12 or 13 was given the power to beat, rape, or sell me, that's different. Because you have nurtured, fed, and kept alive this person and loved it. It's hard to nurse a child and not love it, or at least, you know, feel that care. So to have that human being become this other thing. There are incredible stories and collections of slave narratives about what slave women did when that happened. There's a story of a woman who spilled milk in the barn, and her mistress sent the son in to beat her because she wasted the milk. And maybe some other things had happened, but for her it was just the last straw. And she looked at him, and she remembered what she'd been to him. And she took the stick away from him that he was going to beat her with, and she just beat him. Well, she had to leave, so she had to run away. And she lived in a cave for months with her young daughter, bringing her food. And she, you know, there's these incredible stories where they just, you know, you're taking your life into your own hand when you respond that way. But I think if you hear that story and think of it as not a slave, but as you doing it, how does it make you feel? Not her, not that mother, but you or your mother. Your mother did that. Then you get the sense of what people are made of and what they're liable to do, and how distorted that kind of oppression is when it distorts human behavior so wildly and so violently. Well, the origin of the 7 Days was based on rumor. I always heard that there was an organization of black men who were like avengers, and they were anonymous, and they ran around doing what the 7 Days did. I never knew any of them. I never had any documentation, but it was a very popular rumor. So I used that as an example of this radical, anarchic, revolutionary man in Song of Solomon. The other part of your question interests me because sometimes, once in a while, the connections are deliberate. When I'm really trying to feed into a culture that is older than the one that blacks cobbled together in this country, in the diaspora. But what is amazing to me is how many times I use culture that I take for granted because it was my mother's, my grandmother's, her grandmother's, aunts. It's just the culture which I've grown up in, only to learn, as you have indicated, from Africans from all parts of that continent, that they recognized ritual, sayings, beliefs in my work that are there. So you can tell there's some movement in the, you know, the ghost who sits on a stump. All the ghosts I've ever known always appeared sitting on a stump. The ghost who comes out of the water, I mean, the reincarnation, the looking at oneself in water, and what happens when you break it. I mean, all these things were all part of the mythology, the culture that I grew up in, and apparently have real living life in other African cultures that have been redistributed among us. And I would just love to see the history of some of those things taken from my books. It would be fascinating to me. Oh, a lot of research. I have to know, particularly if books have supernatural elements in it, I have to be very sure that all the facts are facts. I just don't like to do the research before I have the story under my belt, because I like to do research, and it would just keep me going to the library forever. Everything leads to something else. So I try to control it. The book I'm writing now takes place in a place I've never been to, in an industry I don't know anything about. So I have to know exactly what that is now that the narrative is sort of done. I mean, thought through, not written through. And so now I have to know everything. I have to know how far things are. I have to know what color green that curtain is. I have to know the name of all those tools. I have to know what the name of the railroad was. Everything. So it's all details that contribute to the authenticity and the credibility of the period. Take the words that you find dangerous or misleading or generalized or romanticized, put them on the board, and define them for your students, and then tell them why you think they're dangerous. And then you get a nice discussion about the danger of language, not just bell hooks' language or mine or anybody's, but what the power of language is, how it can indeed hurt or mislead. And the students may argue with you about that, and that would be very good for your class. But I wouldn't prevent it from coming into the class. I wouldn't prevent your students from reading bell hooks. I would just give them the tools to analyze it and understand it. 60 is supposed to be the milestone. Anything after that is gravy. Yeah, I'll be 70 in a couple of weeks. Absolutely astounds me. Because you know what happens is you just end up a certain age inside. I mean, 32, 26, it's a different age, but everybody knows what it is, how old you are on the inside. And what happens after that is like somebody else is doing. So, you know, it's sort of a strange mythical age, which I happen to like a lot. I think some of my friends don't like it so much because they are backing up a little bit. And I'm constantly telling people how old I am. And there's not a year that I have lived that I don't want to say is my own. Oh, God, yes. Oh, yeah. If you're open, and if you know how you came to these sort of inveterate conclusions you've had before, then you're frightened to say, I know this is the way and this is the answer. Particularly at this age, where a friend of mine was saying, you know, all the irrevocable mistakes, we've already made those. All the things we didn't know and still don't know, that's all there. Now you're free. You can change your mind. You can make a mistake. You can learn something new. Absolutely. Wholly. My pleasure.